Welcome to E3G's press briefing. It's a briefing we put together for journalist colleagues on what the World Bank and IMF spring meetings, which start on the 10th of April, will mean for climate and development. And the simple fact that we've pulled this briefing together shows that we think it's incredibly important for climate and development. I'm Ronan Palmer. I'm the Director for Clean Economy at E3G. I'll be chairing today. I'll introduce you in a moment to our speakers. They'll each have about 6 or 7 minutes to talk. And after that, we're really keen to take questions from all of you. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Alternatively, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Please pop your questions in there. And I'm accompanied today by two of my E3G colleagues, Delaney Roscoe and Sonia Dunlop. And I'm going to hand over right away to you, Sonia, to explain why these spring meetings are essential for the climate action in the World Bank and multilateral development banks. So over to you, Sonia.
Thanks so much, Ronan. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Sonia Dunlop. I'm the Programme Lead for Public Banks and Multilateral Development Banks at E3G. We're a climate change think tank with offices all over the world. I will be at the spring meetings myself in person in Washington, DC from the 10th to the 14th of April, and like all other E3G staff on the ground, available for any print or broadcast interviews while we are there. I think these spring meetings are absolutely crucial. They're coming at an absolutely critical time in the history of the global international financial architecture, the global international financial system, the global Bretton Woods system over the last 80 years. And there has, in the last 5 years I've been working on this, but arguably in the last few decades in this space, never has there been a time when there's been so much political attention on the World Bank, the IMF, the other multilateral development banks, and specifically so much attention on the climate change related potential of these institutions and how they really are just absolutely critical in terms of financing and leading the transition towards climate safe and climate resilient development in every corner of the earth going forwards. So this is a huge moment, and so these spring meetings are going to be more important in many ways than many of their previous iterations. In terms of the World Bank specifically, as many of you know, obviously we are in a transition phase. Last month, the former president of the World Bank, the outgoing president of the World Bank, David Malpass, resigned. The US has nominated its preferred candidate to take over next, Mr. Ajay Banga, and obviously a lot of key governments have come out and supported that nomination. Ajay Banga himself will not be at the spring meetings. This is still the transition period. But clearly this is the beginning of a new era for the World Bank in many ways, and therefore for the rest of the MDB system in many ways, and a key moment for defining the future vision, mission, and scope and size of the World Bank going forwards. Much of the political momentum that we have seen in this space has come from the Bridgetown Initiative, and a political initiative led by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, launched last summer with the support of a number of developed and developing countries to really try and reform the international climate and development finance system in order to make it more fit for purpose to address the climate emergency. And specifically, the process that's going on in terms of the World Bank is, of course, that of the evolution roadmap, the World Bank's evolution roadmap, called for by Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, by a number of other G7 and non-G7 governments. And the spring meetings is going to be a key moment, and there's essentially going to be a new draft of the evolution roadmap, a post-Banga nomination draft of the evolution roadmap submitted to the Development Committee during the week of the spring meeting. It's also a key moment in terms of the size of the World Bank going forwards. The Capital Adequacy Framework Review and the recommendations of the G20 Capital Adequacy Framework Review are still being discussed and considered. It is likely that we're going to see a reducing of the equities to loan ratio of the World Bank down to 19%, which should liberate a small amount of money, really 40 billion over 10 years. But what we're really hoping, and what a lot of the signals that some of the key shareholders are also sending, is that implementation of key parts of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review are step one in a multi-step process, where next we really have to start thinking about fresh injections of capital into the World Bank and the other MDBs that need it most. So there's obviously an urgent need for an IDA replenishment, and World Bank leadership are making that a priority. But other MDBs like African Development Bank, arguably European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, are also ripe for capital increases and capital injections. And so we will very much be advocating for that, and advocating for that to happen based on an MDB's performance on climate issues. We have a website, the E3G Public Banks Climate Tracker Matrix website. We'll put the link in the chat in a moment. But there, where we assess the performance of the MDBs on different climate related aspects of their climate work, and the shareholders use those assessments in order to inform their advocacy towards the MDBs. And we would definitely recommend looking at that before deciding, if you're a shareholder, before deciding where to put your money. We know that there's going to be a lot of ministers in town in DC. They're going to be having meetings in multiple different permutations on World Bank reform. We will be watching the communique that comes out of the Development Committee meeting. And for us, this is also very much a staging post to the Macron, Motley and Modi summit that's being held in Paris, the summit on a new global financing pact with the Global South, which was kicked off by French President Emmanuel Macron at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, which will very much be a moment to push ahead with this whole agenda of evolution of the global international financial architecture. There are also relevant processes going on with other MDBs, so this isn't just about the World Bank, it's also about other multilateral development banks. They are also considering the CAF recommendations, the Capital Adequacy Framework Review recommendations, and also getting ready for their own versions of the evolution roadmap. And then in the case of African Development Bank, pushing hard and exploring options for how they could be a recipient of special drawing rights. Lastly, I just want to say there's also a lot of progress that's been made in terms of alignment with the Paris Agreement at the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks. This is a key part of mainstreaming climate commitments and mainstreaming climate in everything that these banks do. Just 2 weeks ago, the World Bank published its full detailed methodologies as to how it's going to make sure that all of its operations, whether that be policy-based loans, whether that be in direct investments, whether that be indirect finance into financial intermediaries, how it's going to check those, that those are going to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. We welcome the fact that this is now in the public domain and this is more transparent, but we do think that that could be done in a more robust way, really checking whether projects are aligned with the 1.5 degree target, and really making sure that it's not just using the country level plans, the nationally determined contributions. But from the 1st of July, every project that goes to the board of the World Bank will be, in theory, according to this methodology, aligned with the Paris Agreement. The devil will be in the detail. That's all from me. I'll hand back to my colleague Ronan. I'm happy to take any questions in a minute. Thanks.
Sonia, thank you very much. And I'm going to pass straight away to Delaney, talk a bit more about the Springs, the IMF, and the global financial architecture supporting transition. Delaney, over to you.
Yeah, I'm Delaney Orozco. I work as a senior policy advisor at E3G. I lead our work of macroeconomic issues, also known as fiscal issues, debt, and all the microfinancial institutions, including the IMF. So before I go into a deep dive of what to expect from the IMF, I think it would be really good to understand what's the theme of this meeting. Like every year, the spring and the annual meeting have a theme. This year is about reshaping, developing a new era. This is a new era. What's the era we're entering in? Well, we haven't exited. We thought we were going to be exiting COVID into this idea of renewed growth, but in reality, we have overlapping crises, climate risk, war, food price, inflation, and this massive risk of fragmentation that rather than a renewed multilateralism. And that's why this venue is so important to look. So there will be, rightly so, like Sonia said, a lot of focus on the World Bank in the spring meetings, but we have heard less about the IMF. Part of this is down to the outstanding leadership provided by Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director. But this is one part of the equation. We need to make sure that we can bring, the IMF needs to make sure it needs to bring the countries with them. So one of the key things for the IMF and their kind of the litmus test will be for the new era, how they're going to be reconciling the IMF's traditional emphasis on fiscal consolidation, meaning budget cuts, increasing taxation in a moment where we need almost unprecedented levels of investment to finance the plans the countries are going to be putting forward to deliver their own transition. So a key thing to look for is under the IMFC, which is basically the committee that advises the board of governors. I will be very keen to look how the IMF is going to be recognizing this idea of moving away from one size fits all approach when it comes to fiscal advice in addressing climate issues. I think that's going to be very important because we know that every transition would be different in each country. So they need to tailor their advice. And also the IMF financing facilities tend to fall short in supporting long-term investment. So, and that's implicitly avoiding countries to make a decisive switch onto a sustainable development pathway. And the third thing I'll be looking into is that all of this is compounded by the current framework of the debt sustainability assessment. What this means is that this overemphasis on the need for fiscal consolidation, fiscal austerity, is just going to be a massive barrier for the transition. But it doesn't take into account the nature of the challenge that countries are going to be facing with increasing investment upfront, for example. So we like to see the discussion on how that sustainability assessment might evolve in this new era. So in some ways, I just want to go back to the fact that the IMF is facing less scrutiny in the spring meetings. There is no such a thing as like the evolution roadmap of the IMF, because partly there's, like I said before, this strong leadership from Kristalina. However, the IMF, to maintain this position of climate leadership and to continue to serve its member countries, which is more than 190 countries in the world, the IMF will need to move from a strong message from its leadership and a number of initiatives to a state where climate is embedded in the whole DNA of the IMF, meaning operations in advance, the operational side, but also the advice they provide. And I'm actually really hoping to see that clear statement coming through in the committee that I mentioned, the IMFC. And it would be good for them to recognize and push the fund to move forward with this. Ultimately, they're the one that's going to provide the directional travel of the institutions, of the IMF in this case. So I guess one of the other points I wanted to mention is that we would like to see the IMF also thinking about how they're going to be dealing with the way that they fit into the whole global safety net. What's the added value when it comes to the transition? That's where the partnership, and we'll be seeing a renewed partnership with the World Bank going forward. So we'll stop there because I think we're taking a lot of time, Ronan, but over to you.
Not at all, Dilly and Sonia, both really excellent reflections on what's happening. I just wanted to close this little bit by reflecting a bit more on how the Springs themselves as a venue are really important to the overall momentum of reforming the global economy. Obviously, the spring meetings are, in a sense, the IMF's show, the World Bank show, but we know so many people turn up there, so many important conversations are had, and so many decisions may not necessarily be made or announced, but the nuggets of those decisions, the core ideas will be pulled together at the Springs. So I just want to reflect a little bit on our kind of wider hopes for that. So we know leaders have been calling in transformation of the system for a long time. Some of this is in the light of COVID, but also because we have seen that the system is not greatly addressing the crises such as climate, the food crisis, nor indeed helping development. And we know that the evolution of the system has started. We've talked, Sonia and Dile, about Bridgetown, about the Paris Summit and a Global Financing Act. That's an excellent work that's been done by India's G20 presidency on this. But even before that, we had seen work done by G20 and the OECD on global taxation, the global minimum corporate tax rate. We saw the huge issuance, 650 billion special drawing rights by the IMF in very fast time during COVID. And then there's the whole raft of changes that Sonia outlined about the World Bank. So evolution is happening. We also know that less developed countries who will be present and very vocal in Washington have some entirely legitimate concerns on things like totally vital action on climate, on crises. They all know it's needed. They welcome it, but they also want reassurance that this is not going to reduce the finance available or the action available for more traditional development assistance. So that's why when it comes to the Springs, I really hope World Bank, the IMF, finance ministers and finance influencers present are going to be able to use the event to build confidence in the evolution of the global financial system. Confidence that it will evolve to something that is more fair for people, more resilient for people into the future. I particularly pick out the G7 on this. I know it's easy to pick on the G7, but it is really important that the leaders of the world's richest economies show that they are open to innovations that are based on priorities of middle and low income countries and co-designing those innovations with them. There has to be real global ownership of solutions to debt, of solutions to concessional finance, and on solutions to real development, real green, net zero growth across the world. So those are my hopes for these spring meetings. Now with that, I want to finish what we have said. We have said plenty. Please, we brought you here to ask us questions. So do post any questions in the chat or raise your hand. But I'm going to turn first to Megan Rowling from Thomson Reuters Foundation. I do apologize, Megan. It's okay. Great to have you here.
Thanks. Hiya. Yeah, I was just wondering, thanks for the overview. That's really helpful. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about any specific initiatives that you think might come out of the Springs in terms of helping low-income countries deal with the debt squeeze, debt issues. Also, if there are any updates on the IMF's Sustainability and Resilience Trust, I'm not sure I can't remember the exact name of it, what's been going on with that, but the one that was set up to kind of help with climate resilience. And then just finally, if I may, any specific advances you think can be made in these meetings that link in with the Bridgetown agenda, and how the spring meetings can support efforts at the Paris summit? Sorry, that's a lot, but there's a lot going on.
No, there's always a lot going on, and if I take the first of it, and then I'll hand to Dilay and then Sonia on your RST questions and on Bridgetown. Just in terms of debt, clearly a lot of work is going on in terms of the Paris Club engagement between the Paris Club and observer nations at Paris, such as China. In terms of what needs to be done about specific countries, an ongoing debate about whether there is an impending debt crisis, or as our good friend at the CGD has pointed out, there may not be a debt crisis, but there's certainly going to be a development crisis if we don't address this. So the whole point of what we have been saying here is the scope for these meetings to firstly raise the prospect of new funding into this, and raise the scope for the IMF particularly, but also people like the Paris Club to address the debt crisis. I am not anticipating huge statements on this unless Dilay and Sonia have some insight that I don't have, but I am expecting this to really set the agenda for Paris in June. And bear in mind the annual meetings are taking place in Marrakesh in October and November, and let's check my diary. And I certainly think that an annual meeting set on the African continent are going to be a really powerful place to get these messages across. Dilay, can I turn to you both on that, but also any specific reflections on the RST, and then it pass to Sonia?
No, I think I do agree with you. I don't think we're going to see much coming from the IMF. I think they will be encouraging, I will expect the IMF committee, the communique they're going to put out, or also the development committee, to kind of reinforcing the idea that we need to, that the both institutions need to be working on finding solutions around that. Specifically on that, I'm not sure, but I'm aware that the IMF will be hosting, under the Kristalina's leadership, this global sovereign debt roundtable during the spring. So it would be interesting if there's going to be any communications from her in terms of updating. But like Ronan said, I don't think there's be anything material coming out of that. In terms of the RST, which is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund, I think it started to enter operation last year. I think there's been already 5 countries that have been, I think it's been Costa Rica, Barbados, Rwanda, Jamaica, and Bangladesh. So those are the countries that have requested support to the IMF. This is a new and promising, and potentially is going to be under-delivering trust, unfortunately, because as far as we know, because there hasn't been much public information on this, funds haven't been dispersed. It will depend on how the reforms are implemented. Also, we know that the RST, to have access to this sustainability, to the RSF, basically countries need to have what's called upper tranche, or like an existing program with the IMF. And this is where the conflict comes in, because the existing programs with the IMF are very short term. They focus on fiscal consolidation very strongly. And that's where that's why I was referring this idea of one size fits all. So the IMF is trying to marry his traditional approach with this new innovation they have created, and they might be that's where I feel that they might be over-promising of how they would be able to support economies to transform and adapt to both, like, manage the transition and adapt to climate change. So I would say right now, so far, 20 billion of funding has been received for the RSF. However, the goal was, I think, around 42 billion. I think that was Kristalina's goal. So still, what I would expect maybe by the springs is more contributions going to the RSF. That would be interesting to see. So it's kind of, you have a Resilient Sustainability Trust Fund kind of operating with not many resources and with potentially a staff on you who's still learning by doing how to approach climate change with the same tools they had before. So it's very early. I wouldn't be too harsh with them. I think it's very early to say how impactful it's going to be. However, this is an innovation that we should welcome from the IMF, because it was something that was put together so quickly for IMF standards. But this is why I reinforce the idea: how can the leadership of Kristalina translate into the DNA of the institution? Which is still, we still don't know how this is going to happen.
Thank you, Dile. Sonia, I'll pass to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Delaney is really the expert on this, but just to say, in terms of specific bits of progress on the Bridgetown agenda writ large, I mean, the Bridgetown agenda, the Bridgetown initiative has really been pushing for full implementation of the recommendations of the G20 Capital Adequacy Framework Review, and we're going to see some baby steps on that. As I said, the lowering of the equity to loan ratio to 19%. The Bridgetown initiative has also been pushing more broadly in terms of integrating climate into the missions of these institutions, and we are going to see a proposal to amend the official mission statement of the World Bank to include fostering sustainable and inclusive development in order to end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity, as is the current twin goals, as it were. And there are going to be some changes to the statutory lending limits as well for specific countries. But most of the answers have already been given by Delaney. Thanks.
Sonia, while you're talking, could I ask you to pick up the question from Marine of, I think it's AEF, to say precisely what you would be advocating in terms of capital requirements? You gave us a sense of this earlier, but do you want to get specific?
Yeah, I mean, we really are supporting all the recommendations of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review, right? Giving more credit to callable capital, so being clearer as to how the different types of capital, paid-in capital and callable capital, are accounted for inside the MDBs, and ensuring that the MDBs and the shareholders of the MDBs are more open and have a better line of communication with the credit rating agencies to make sure they too are giving more credit to callable capital. We are supporting the recommendation in terms of the need for more innovation in terms of financial instruments, the more innovation in terms of risk guarantees, in terms of potentially selling on some of the assets, syndicating them into the private finance market. And try and open up some of the data around this, which it too can help to create more transparency in terms of the capital adequacy of the MDBs. Fundamentally, so we support all the recommendations of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review, but they in themselves are not enough. We cannot think that having done that, we will have done enough. That could unleash a considerable amount of lending headroom, but then that can only be the first step to creating leaner, more efficient institutions, which then need to be given more financial firepower in the form of fresh capital injections from the shareholders. And we know that's intensely political. We know, that there are different ways of doing it, but one way of doing it could potentially slightly rejig the balance of the different shareholders. But we have to be very clear that the implementation of the capital adequacy framework recommendations are but a first step, and the next step is the fresh capital injection. Does that answer your question, Maheen? I could also tell you that the French government has really been, the French and the Italian governments really have, but especially the French government has really been leading the way in terms of pushing for full implementation of the capital adequacy framework review recommendations, trying to create a process going forward, trying to keep tabs on where the process is at the different banks. Of course, everyone's eyes are on the World Bank to start with the general expectation being that then other multilateral development banks will then adapt and copy what the World Bank does on this for their own, in terms of their own capital adequacy frameworks. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Marion, for finding that helpful. I can really only stress the point that Sonia just made, that the proposals on the table at the moment are really important. They must be delivered. Does that mean that we are then finished and it's all sorted? Not at all. There are huge further steps that need to be taken by the World Bank. But I would also like to pick up questions in the chat from Tim at Semaphore and William Will at DevX, and they both kind of pick up on this question of the tensions that do remain, and that I think it's really important we recognize and address. So absolutely, we're in a situation where we have seen direct aid, overseas development aid, frozen, reduced in some cases. We see countries with very significant levels of debt that needs to be addressed. The Bridgetown initiative is excellent on addressing many of the issues for countries, particularly as an initiative that has had such drive from the wonderful Barbadian Prime Minister Maya Motley, looks at disasters which affect clearly island nations particularly. But it's really important to remember that for a great many of the low-income countries, they are not looking for extra lending capacity. They are looking for direct aid and direct support. They are looking for strongly concessional finance. They're looking for grant aid. And of course, the other thing that countries are looking for is not just money that they then buy things, but they want to develop. They want, I often remind people I'm sitting down with that it is no good giving loans to countries so that they can then come and buy rich countries' technology. They also want to be able to manufacture themselves. So this is solving some of the finance problems, but many countries are quite legitimately saying that, is it giving me a path to development? And I think that's where I pick up the point that you make. Sorry, I have lost it now, Tim, on whether there is a valid concern about a conflict between development and climate. At one level, absolutely not. If you try to develop your economy with taking climate into account, you will not develop your economy. You will set it on a path for failure, and you will miss opportunities. On the other hand, while addressing climate concerns, we've got to make sure that the schools and the hospitals are built. They've got to be built resilient to climate change. They've got to be incredibly efficient, but they are vital. We don't want to be replacing, to balance development in a way that actually doesn't make everybody's life better. the reason people like us at E3G are passionate about climate is because it is messing people's lives. That's the bottom line, and we want that to change. So, and I would really welcome Sonia, and Dile may want to come in on this as well, but I think that it's really important that we address climate and development together as a piece, and that we recognize the scale of the task ahead. Sonia, Dile, did you want to come in on that? Okay, in which case you do not escape, because Thomas from Süddeutsche Zeitung has just asked us about complaints that the World Bank is still directly and indirectly putting a lot of money into the promotion of fossil energies. Thomas, you couldn't have asked that question at a better time, because you have Sonia about to tell you the whole truth on this. Sonia.
Yes, thanks for the question, Thomas. You're right. This is one of the most controversial issues that remain in terms of what it means to really green and properly Paris align what the World Bank is doing. I wanted to distinguish between direct finance of fossil fuel projects and indirect finance of fossil fuel projects, and also just put a link in the chat to the relevant page of the E3G website, our E3G Public Bank MDB Climate Tracker Matrix website, where you can see the full details of the World Bank fossil fuel policies, all the other MDB fossil fuel policies, and then we also, on a separate page, we have the comparison of how the ratios between green and fossil finance work are across the different institutions. Yes, so there's a difference between direct and indirect financing. There are some signs that in terms of the core World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the International Development Association, IBRD and IDA, that their direct support for oil and gas projects and fossil fuel projects seems to be dwindling to near zero. This could probably be in large part because the US Treasury in August of 2021 published new updated guidance of what projects it would and wouldn't support at the boards of MDBs in terms of fossil fuels. And it established a number of 4 cumulative, quite relatively strict criteria in terms of what it would and wouldn't support. That has then meant that has almost de facto become the World Bank's energy policy. And fossil fuel policy, and has restricted the pipeline of projects going to the board. However, as you say, your question is specifically about the promotion of fossil energies, and there is still a lot of indirect support of fossil fuel projects coming from the World Bank. We're specifically thinking of support through financial intermediaries with equity investments in particular. IFC does a lot of equity investments into financial intermediaries. In theory, that is from the 1st of July all going to be subject to the joint MDB guidance on Paris Agreement alignment, and also to the IFC green equity approach, which is gradually phasing coal out of the portfolios of the banks where they do equity investments. But there is still a lot of promotion as well in terms of policy-based loans, development policy lending, where a lot of the other civil society organizations that we work with do a lot of detailed research and find a lot of examples of indirect support. I really do hope that given the World Bank has got a new leadership taking over, a fresh pair of hands at the wheel, is entering a new era of having climate as part of its main mission and vision, having climate fully integrated into the different levels and every area of work at the bank, having every single operation in theory aligned with the Paris Agreement according to their methodology, which is not perfect, but it's an improvement. That we will further see this pipeline of projects be restricted and finally go down to zero, and a huge scaling up, of course, of support for clean energy projects and renewable energy projects and grid investments and smart energy investments and so on, even though there are, of course, challenges in terms of supply chains. But we're definitely moving in the right direction there. And so any signs that reaffirm that at these spring meetings will be very important for the civil society community that watch and scrutinize the work of the World Bank. Thanks.
I promised you a good answer there, Thomas, and I think you got one. Thank you very much, Sonia. Tila, Marion has asked if we think the summit plan, the June summit in Paris, the Global Financial Pact, is going to help momentum. If you could answer that, and then if we could tee up Megan again from Thomson Reuters to ask when you finished. Tila, over to you.
Well, I guess the short answer is like, it's a key moment in this year. I think it's a moment to watch for. It's a moment that I would see the spring meetings as setting kind of a tone of what we've seen from the multilateral development banks, but also the IMF. And you will see from the communique some of the disagreements or agreements coming from the major shareholders, which are also the ministers of finance or minister of development in many cases. So I guess from the Paris summit, I think it would be a moment for what Ronan mentioned before, a key moment to kind of renew that multilateralism, kind of check in how the co-design of this new financing pact is going to be moving forward. And if you look at some of like the little things that are coming up in terms of what's going to be discussed, it's very interesting, innovative, what are going to be innovative sources of finance, like same discussions that the IMF is having when it comes to loss and damage. So there's going to be, there's going to be interesting things coming out of that. The key question to look for is whether there's going to be just a communique or will bring action after it. And I think that would be something. It's just not just the Paris summit in itself, it's what the Paris summit was, how the Paris summit will keep momentum for the rest of the other agendas. And I do believe is the Paris summit, or the summit in Paris, because it's not the Paris summit. I think there's something we need to get better at how we communicate. It's the summit in Paris, where they came out last year from the COP28, where Mia Mottley, where Macron supported some of the agenda around the Bridgetown that Mia Mottley is pushing. So it's interesting to see that political appetite to find solutions. So we see that as a key moment in time. It's interesting that it's taking place just right after G7, before the COP. So it will be a key moment to take stock where we are, but also where we're going after that. And particularly given that next year is going to be also a big year for the international system when we talk about the Bretton Woods institutions.
Yeah, that's really well picked up there. I was looking at Marion's question. She talked about the summit planned in Paris in June. We revert all too easily to referring to it as the Paris summit. It is, of course, very deliberately framed as the summit on a new global financing pact. It's a global summit. People have to sit somewhere. It'll be lovely to sit in Paris. Megan, back to you again, please.
Thanks. A couple of follow-up questions. Ren, you were talking about that there's less likely to be a debt crisis than a development crisis. I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, why that's the case, and whether we'll narrowly escape a debt crisis, but because just why you said that. And then also this issue that you mentioned about the need, if the transition is going to be a just transition, that there has to be more kind of value added manufacturing, etc., taking place in developing countries. What can the MDBs, the IFIs do to enable that? Because we're hearing it a lot, but it's not clear if and how it's going to happen.
Okay, so on the debt crisis, development crisis, I am actually going to quote my good friend, our good friend at E3G, Masood Ahmed, who heads the Center for Global Development in Washington. And I'm going to quote him direct because it is what he says is so powerful. He says, "I don't think we're going to have many defaults. The cost of default is very high. What we are going to see is that unsustainable debt service is going to lead to development crises rather than debt crises. There will be default for future generations, cutting back on investments for the future." And I think that's really powerfully put. And Masood and us have often talked through this problem that by not addressing debt, development, and climate as a piece, all we're doing is we're moving things around and pushing crises further into the future. And I think this is why I am concerned. I am almost more concerned that we will not confront the debt crisis or the poly crisis, as Adam Tisnavas call it, as a whole, and instead we'll try to play some kind of, what's that game, whack-a-mole, where we're trying to push a crisis away on this side, push a different crisis away on the other side, and say it's all right, we're dealing with each of these. And actually they're just all piling up somewhere else, or they'll turn up as Masood says, you know, that we won't see a debt crisis, instead we'll see a development crisis, because we'll pretend there isn't a debt crisis, and we just won't let countries develop. I think that would be absolutely tragic. And I think that's, you know, that is so important that there's Chris Bretos, when we come to in a moment, has also asked some really powerful questions on this. In terms of the more value added, I'd really like to get Sonia's view on this in terms of what can the MDBs do. But I would simply point out how strong an ask there has been from countries such as Chile with vast, and I will never remember, I believe it is lithium that Chile has in vast quantums, but it could be cobalt, I think it's lithium. So what does it do? Does it export its lithium so somebody rich processes it, or do you stick the factory in Chile? And the present Chilean government is very clear in what it should see, what he would like to see. As we develop new technologies, there are real opportunities that countries are seeing for real value added and moving away from just extracting. And in many ways, the history of fossil fuels has been such a history of extracting stuff from places. Whereas I think the net zero economy, the clean economy, does have immense potential for this. Now, MDBs are going to be really important. Sonia, do you want to reflect on where you think they might step in and how good you think they might be in this space?
Yeah, I mean, you know, MDBs are really important sources of concessional and cheap finance for many of these developing countries, and the poorer the country, often the cheaper the finance. But not only that, but can also provide a huge amount of technical assistance and advisory work to help make the business case for these manufacturing plants or whatever other project it might be, and do a lot of project preparation that can help them get these projects to the final hurdle and catalyze private investment as well. And I just wanted to emphasize how it can also help think strategically about what the long-term strategy of a country should be in terms of its industrial policy and what manufacturing it should be going after. Remember, these banks, the multilateral development banks, are not just money banks, they're knowledge banks as well, right? They're kind of like specialist think tanks in terms of development. And in that sense, you know, helping a country think through, well, what is its national climate plan, its nationally determined contribution, what's its long-term strategy, how does that, you know, how can that be amalgamated in one single country climate development report, which is one of these new reports that the World Bank is putting together for different countries. In and of itself, nothing powerful. But if that then becomes an investment plan, and if that then becomes the basis for a country platform for more country coordination of all the different MDBs and donors in a country, as we've seen a bit in the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, the JETPs, then that's very powerful. But of course, the downside is that the MDBs also come with a lot of baggage in terms of their rightfully strict environmental, social and governance criteria, their strict due diligence processes, their exclusions and so on. And so I think that additional advice and knowledge to help prepare projects is always balanced out by those additional bureaucratic conditions in terms of strict environmental criteria and so on when it comes to loans. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Sonia. Really important. I'm going to turn out to Chris Retos from Res Co-op. You've asked two questions, Chris. Firstly, about whether the IMF or a bank would consider debt cancellation, debt for climate swaps, and secondly, a question about the 5% levy on fossil companies. The second one is an issue I am extremely interested in, I can tell you. But I wonder if I could turn, perhaps, Dile, do you want to have a reflection on those first, and then I'll turn to you, Sonia?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the debt one. I think, I'm not sure I understood the question, because there are two things. Is the IMF and the World Bank promoting the idea of debt for climate swaps? Totally. I think they think Kristalina is completely on board on this. I've reading a lot of blogs on this. The IMF staff has actually they did an amazing report looking at where the tax conditions where that for climate swaps could work. The key question for me and the key thing I keep emphasizing is to look at the debt issue in three different categories. How to address the liquidity, meaning the debt, the issue around servicing debt, and that's an issue for certain countries. That's very much connected to what Rana was saying in terms of development. That's one thing, and that's where the global sovereign debt roundtable is so important, because the common framework, well, it's not delivering as we wanted, or as the G20 was expecting. The other thing is around, the other thing is around solvency. But I think one element that's being completely forgotten is that countries are going to still borrow. Countries are still going to need more finance, either from the MDBs, either from capital markets. And this is something that we need to get, like the solutions around there are less well understood. Like how the cost of capital are going to be reduced. Are we going to see what's going to happen with capital flows? What do we do with hot money, right? How this is going to be smooth. So I think those, for me, is rather than whether the IMF or the World Bank are going to provide debt cancellation or debt for climate swaps, is what are the options they're putting forward for dealing to those three categories: the liquidity issue, the solvency, and also the new finance. Those are three elements that are really important. And for the new finance, that's where, for example, a key resource is the MDBs, of course, but that's where you potentially need capital increase, because that's how you create more concessional finance. So that's important, that side. In terms of what's the role of the IMF and the World Bank in providing debt relief, to be honest, I think they're mostly useful in terms of providing support, continued support for countries. The main reason is that, like Sonia said, finance from these institutions is cheaper. If you look at the cost of capital in some of those economies, it's much cheaper to have to go to the MDBs, and they need that line of kind of support as well, not only when it comes to financing, but also when it comes to knowledge, which is something that is essential for someone, particularly for climate. So I will stop there, and over to you, Rana.
All right, thank you very much. And I can't help but say something to your other question, Chris, that the 5% levy. In general, I think the IMF has always been supportive of better ways of pricing and revenue raising to support action on development, action on climate. I simply have no idea what they think about the 5% levy, but I would simply note that there are now a growing number of options sitting out there, from aviation taxation, maritime taxation, the levy on fossil companies, extraction taxations, and as I mentioned earlier, G20 and the OECD's work on tax base erosion and on the corporate tax rate does show that there is a growing acceptance of the need for driving fresh funding into this. So not just lending, but actually how do we set the right incentives for companies? So it does look to me like that things are changing on that front too. So again, let's see if more of this comes out of the Springs, but I can guarantee you that this will be discussed extensively through Paris, through the summit on new global financial pact in Paris, and into the future. Now, we are coming up to the top of the hour. This has been really interesting for us. I hope it has been really interesting for you. As Sonia mentioned at the beginning, the E3G team, including Sonia and Delaney, will be on the ground in Washington, DC during the spring meetings. The team will be available at your disposal, broadcast or print, on the record, off the record, and I can guarantee you in multiple languages. So we'll give you more details on this when we put out our press release next week. Press@e3g.org is the place to go to if you have any questions on this, or indeed any questions in any aspect where you want to approach E3G. And I would really like to thank our press team for the work they did in pulling this together, and the help they gave us, and the help I hope that they've given each one of you today in bringing this together and into the future. I would really like to thank Sonia and Delaney. It is always a pleasure to work with you both. This has been brilliant. You have been brilliant. And I'd really like to thank everybody who came to this. Wonderful questions, wonderful discussion. I really appreciate it. And I hope you all enjoy these spring meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.